He arrived with 2 suitcases and a quiet kind of confidence that didn't belong to a boy, but to a man who had already been shaped by disappointment and observation. I watched from the upstairs window as he stepped out of the cab, stretched his arms, and looked around like someone returning home, even though this place had never truly been his. My husband was already outside, waving to him like he was welcoming back a soldier. His face lit up more than I'd seen in months. That smile of his, broad and solid, had once been my anchor, but now it felt more like habit than connection. I stood at the mirror in the hallway for longer than necessary before going down to meet them. It wasn't vanity, not really. It was awareness. I adjusted the collar of my linen shirt and added a dab of perfume behind my ears. The same one I wore when we first got married. I don't know why I did that. He looked taller than I remembered. His voice deeper, slower, and his hug carried warmth that wasn't eager or performative. Just real. I hadn't felt something so uncalculated in a long time. The plan was that he'd stay for a couple of months, just while he interned at a local architecture firm. His mother, my husband's daughter from his first marriage, had practically begged us. He just needs some peace and structure, she'd said. Funny, because peace and structure was all this house had become. We set him up in the guest room upstairs. It used to be a study before we stopped needing a space for dreams. The first days passed easily. He was polite, helpful, always the first to offer help with groceries or dishes. And unlike my husband, he actually listened. Not nodded. Listened. I'd mentioned some silly article I read, or how the dog from next door always barked at delivery trucks, and he'd ask follow-up questions, curious ones. That shouldn't have meant anything, but it did. Attention has a flavor. When you've been without it long enough, even crumbs can taste like a feast. He started jogging in the mornings. I would hear the door quietly click shut around 6:30, and by the time I'd be pouring my first cup of coffee, he'd come back, cheeks flushed and hair damp from sweat. That was when I noticed myself pulling the neckline of my robe just a bit closer, or choosing a tighter pair of yoga pants. Stupid things, I know, but I'm not blind. I saw how his eyes paused, not gawking, just lingering. Respectful, but interested. My husband never noticed. He was grateful for the extra help around the house. They'd chat about cars, stocks, weather, safe things. But once, I caught him watching us from the patio. I was handing the man, an iced tea. Our fingers touched. It lasted half a second too long. My husband looked away. That evening, I lay next to my husband in bed, listening to him breathe. We hadn't touched in weeks. Not really. There was a rhythm to our intimacy now, like checking a box on a to-do list. He thought I needed flowers, but it wasn't flowers I missed. It was the feeling of someone wanting me so badly that they forgot everything else. I started spending more time in the kitchen. Not because I suddenly loved cooking, but because it became a place of proximity. I'd ask him to reach for something on the high shelf, even when I could have easily done it myself. I started wearing jewelry again, small earrings, bracelets that clinked softly when I moved my hand. One morning, he caught me singing to myself while doing dishes. I hadn't realized I was doing it. "You have a nice voice," he said, not looking. Up from the book he was reading at the kitchen table. It was such a nothing sentence, and yet it clung to me all day like a silk thread wrapped around my wrist. At night, I found myself wondering where he'd go after this, who he'd love, whether he noticed the things I didn't say, and why, when he passed me in the hallway, my heart beat faster, not with fear, not with guilt, but with something I hadn't felt in years. I told myself it was just curiosity. Just boredom, just the flattering attention of a young man who didn't yet know better. But late one evening, as I stood in the doorway to his room, holding a freshly washed towel, and he looked up from his laptop and smiled at me like I was more than just his grandfather's wife, I knew something had already shifted. Not between us, but inside me. And that was the beginning of a different kind of silence in the house. Not cold, not awkward. A silence full of possibility. I started waking up earlier than usual. Not because I needed to. Simply because I wanted. To catch the moment he returned from his run, sweat-soaked shirt clinging to his back, damp hair swept carelessly to the side, his breath still heavy. I told myself I just liked the sound of the front door opening and closing, the comfort of another person moving through the house while everything else was still. But I began changing what I wore in the mornings. Silk instead of cotton, fitted instead of loose. I'd tell myself it was for the weather, or convenience, or anything that wasn't the truth. The day it happened, my husband had driven out to visit his sister in Connecticut, an overnight trip. Nothing dramatic, just family obligations. I offered to stay home. "You hate the traffic," he'd said. I nodded. That wasn't the reason, of course. I just didn't want to be gone. I spent most of the day in the garden. The late May sun wasn't too harsh, and the quiet was perfect. He joined me in the early afternoon, sitting on the stone steps near the hydrangeas. We talked, casually at first, about how quickly the semester had flown by, about his job interviews, about nothing. He asked if I wanted help with dinner. It was the first time he'd offered that unprompted. I said yes, not because I needed help, but because I couldn't remember the last time a man simply wanted to stand next to me while I cooked. In the kitchen, the air was warm, thick with the scent of herbs and garlic. I was slicing tomatoes when he leaned past me to grab a bowl. His arm brushed mine, bare skin on bare skin. I didn't move. Later, we ate at the counter instead of the table. It felt informal, personal, a shared secret, even though nothing had been said. The sink was full of dishes. I told him to leave them for later, but he didn't. I stood beside him, drying each plate. Neither of us looked at the other. We didn't need to. And then, as I reached to take the last glass from his hand, he turned his head. For a second. Too close. Too much eye contact. Too much stillness. And it happened. He leaned in. Not hesitating, not questioning. Our lips touched. Soft. Measured. And I didn't flinch. My body didn't tense or retreat. My fingers stayed wrapped around the towel, motionless. I kissed him back, not deeply, not wildly, but deliberately. And when we pulled away, neither of us spoke. Not a word. The only sound was the gentle drip of the faucet and the faint hum of the refrigerator. He stepped back first, slowly, respectfully. I didn't chase the moment. I didn't pretend it hadn't happened either. I turned off the kitchen light, walked upstairs, and closed the door to the bedroom where my husband's shirt still hung over the chair, untouched. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at my hands. There was no adrenaline, no panic, just a strange calm. Not peaceful, just quiet. For years I had slept beside a man who loved me but didn't see me. I had touched his hand, his back, his face, and always with care, with obligation. But this kiss, short, almost chaste, had cracked something. Open that I didn't realize had been sealed shut. I ran a bath that night, poured in oil I hadn't used in months, closed my eyes as the steam curled around me. I didn't think about the consequences. I didn't think about right or wrong. I thought about how his mouth had tasted faintly of rosemary and wine, how he hadn't tried to deepen it, to push it. He had only responded, like I had, like we both had, and when I climbed into bed, alone. In a house where nothing looked different, but everything had shifted, I let myself feel it fully. The beginning. The next morning, I avoided the kitchen. I lingered upstairs, sipping my coffee slowly in the bedroom armchair, pretending to scroll through emails I'd already read. I could hear him downstairs, moving about quietly, opening a drawer, rinsing a glass, the faint rustle of a cereal box. Every sound made my pulse throb low in my neck. There was no awkwardness in his steps, no indication that anything between us had shifted. But I knew better. Still, I didn't want to test what silence might lie between us in a shared room. When I finally came down, late and freshly showered, I wore a navy dress that clung in the right places. I told myself it was because it was warm outside, because it was clean, because it was just a normal day. But the truth was simpler. I wanted him to look at me. And he did. Just a glance as he passed through the hallway, towel over his shoulder, damp hair curling at the edges. A nod. Nothing more. But the air between us thickened like cream, left too long in the sun. By afternoon, I couldn't pretend any longer. I drove to the small boutique 2 towns over, one I hadn't visited in years. The kind of place where nothing is practical and everything is soft. I tried on lingerie with the care of a woman who wasn't buying it for someone else, but for the version of herself she thought had died in her 30s. Burgundy lace with delicate satin ties, a matching robe so light it felt like air. I stood in front of the changing room mirror for a long time, turning side to side, not judging, just watching. I bought it all. I didn't think about where I'd wear it. That wasn't the point. At home, I hid the box in the back of the closet, behind winter sweaters. I wasn't ready to see it every day, but I needed to know it was there. A secret, waiting to be chosen. That night, we all had dinner, together. My husband had returned, cheerful and oblivious, recounting details about his sister's new dog and a neighbor's collapsed fence. I nodded where appropriate, poured wine, passed the salad bowl. But my skin buzzed. Every movement, every eye contact felt staged. He sat across from me, quiet but present. His fork moved slowly, his gaze occasionally flicking up from his plate. He said little, but I saw it. He was watching me the way someone watches a lit candle near the edge of a table, calm but alert to what might tip. Later, as we cleared dishes, my husband excused himself to take a work call. The moment he stepped onto the patio, I turned to grab a bowl from the counter. Behind me, I felt him pause, just enough to know he was there, not closer, not touching, but close enough for me to hear his breath. He whispered, "You looked different today." I didn't turn around. I didn't reply. I simply set the bowl into the sink and walked away. Upstairs, I undressed slowly, methodically. My skin was flushed, but I wasn't embarrassed. I lay in bed under the ceiling fan, listening to it click softly overhead, thinking about what I had become. Not a villain, not a victim, something harder to define. The next morning, I noticed I had begun wearing perfume again, not for the world, for the house, for the hallway, for the space between us that had turned electric. It was supposed to be a simple weekend errand. Drive up to the cottage, check the roof for leaks, water the outdoor plants, air the linens. A chore, nothing more. My husband had promised to come with me, even suggested the trip himself earlier, that week. But by Friday morning, his schedule had shifted. "There's been a delay on the hospital board's vote," he said, barely looking up from his phone. "I can't get away." He said it with that calm, reasonable voice he used when delegating anything domestic to me, as if home belonged to me alone. As if the things we'd once done together were now simply mine to manage. I said I'd go alone. It wasn't a protest. It just didn't matter anymore. But as I zipped up the overnight bag, folded a light sweater, and reached for the car keys, I paused. He was still upstairs. I walked down the hall to the guest room and knocked gently on the door. "Do you have any plans this weekend?" I asked, my voice steady. He blinked, surprised. "No. Why?" "Come with me." He hesitated. Not because he didn't want to. I could see it in the way his shoulders lifted slightly, the way his eyes brightened for a second before he caught himself. "You sure?" he asked. I nodded once. We didn't speak much on the drive. The highway stretched wide and pale under a soft sky. I kept the windows cracked. Wind tangled my hair, and I didn't bother smoothing it. He watched the fields pass, one hand draped. Over his knee, relaxed. At some point, he turned and said, "I haven't left the city in months." "You needed it," I replied. I didn't mention that I did too. The cottage sat quiet and dignified on the lake's edge, untouched since late autumn. Dust floated in the shafts of light across the wood floor. I opened the windows wide. Air moved through the rooms like breath. I saw him walk to the back porch and stop. I joined him. From that view, you could see the water flickering through the trees, hear the distant hum of boats, occasional birdsong. It was beautiful. I had forgotten how much. We spent the afternoon, wiping counters, unstacking the deck chairs, tossing stale crackers from the pantry. It was the kind of silent teamwork that came easily, without instruction. No assumptions, no boundaries. And maybe that's what made it dangerous. Evening came quietly. I lit a few candles. The kitchen was too warm to cook, so we assembled a cold dinner: roast chicken, olives, bread, cheese. He opened a bottle of wine. We ate on the back porch, wrapped in soft conversation. He asked questions my husband never asked, about my mother's death, about the garden I abandoned years ago, about what I'd do if I didn't have to be anyone. For anyone else, I think, I said after a long pause, I'd learn to swim properly. Just disappear underwater and stay there until everything felt quiet. He looked at me in that moment with such precise attention, I almost turned away. But I didn't. I held it, let him see all the cracks, all the wanting. Night settled around us slowly. The candles began to flicker low. The air cooled. I shivered. "Here," he said, rising. He disappeared into the cottage and returned with a plaid throw blanket. As he draped it over my shoulders, his hand brushed the bare skin near my collarbone. Neither of us moved. I let the touch linger. I closed my eyes for a second, not out of nervousness, but to hold the sensation in stillness. It wasn't his fingers. It was the electricity in my chest, the ache low in my belly, the flush across my neck. We didn't kiss that night, not with our mouths, but our silence did. It said more than words could carry, not recklessness, not lust, recognition. I knew then, with a certainty that unnerved me, I didn't want this to stop, and worse, I didn't think I could. We drove back Sunday just after noon. The cottage had already returned to stillness by the time I turned the key in the lock for the last time. Windows closed, linen stripped, wine bottles disposed of quietly. But the air still held something, a scent, a residue. Maybe not from anything we did, but from everything we hadn't done. The ride back felt different. There was less conversation, but not from discomfort, more like restraint. As if we'd both realized the slope we were on, and now we were watching our own steps. We didn't want to fall, yet we weren't trying to stop the descent either. When we pulled into the driveway, my husband's car was already there. His trip had ended early. He was mowing the lawn, shirt damp with sweat, baseball cap pulled low over his face. He waved. I smiled. Everything about the moment was ordinary, and I hated that I felt relieved. Inside, I showered first. I let the water run hotter than usual, letting it sting my skin like it might rinse off more than just road dust and pine pollen. I didn't rush. I stood still and watched the condensation form on the glass, watching my own shape blur. That night, the house resumed its usual rhythm. Dinner at 7, news on low volume in the background, plates scraped and rinsed in silence. My husband recounted a story from the board meeting. I nodded, replied when needed, asked a question or two. I was good at this, at performance, but I kept catching movement from the corner of my eye, his figure passing from room to room, quietly present, almost spectral. When my husband retreated to the study with his nightly scotch, I lingered in the kitchen. The dishes were already done, the counters wiped. There was no real reason to stay, except he was there too. He entered softly, barefoot, holding a folded blanket from the living room. He placed it on the back of the couch and for a moment just stood near the counter. Close enough to speak quietly, but far enough to respect the unspoken rules we hadn't yet dared break again. "You've been quiet," he said. His voice was low, careful. I didn't look at him. "It's easier that way. Is that what you want?" The silence between us hardened like sugar cooling on a spoon. Sharp, fragile. I turned slowly, finally meeting his eyes. "I don't know what I want," I said. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't true either. He stepped forward, only slightly. Barely a shift in weight, but enough to feel like a tide changing. His eyes didn't ask permission. They held something steadier. Intention. I should have stopped him. Instead, I waited, and when he leaned in, I didn't flinch. The second kiss was nothing like the first. It was longer, slower, deeper. A confirmation, not an accident. He kissed me like someone who had spent weeks imagining it. No haste, no hunger, just pressure and patience. My hands didn't rise to meet him. They didn't need to. My whole body answered without movement. I felt the warmth spread from my mouth to my chest, down to my stomach, like floodlights turning on in a dark theater, and just as quietly, he pulled away. Neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. The space between us had collapsed. We now lived in the same moment, carried the same weight. That night, I didn't sleep beside my husband. I lay there, yes. I faced away from him, listened to the rise and fall of his breath, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I imagined fingers at the small of my back, breath against my neck. The memory of that kiss burned into me like a second skin. When I rose before dawn, the sky was still bruised with night. I stood by the window, robe wrapped loosely around me, and watched the horizon shift from steel to lavender. I wasn't ashamed. I wasn't afraid. I just wanted more. Desire makes a home in silence. It slips between gestures, hides in the ordinary. By the following week, that silence had grown roots in our house. We didn't speak of the kisses, of the night in the kitchen, or of what it meant. But we carried it in our bodies, in glances that lasted too long, in hands that brushed in passing, in footsteps that paused before parting. I stopped pretending that nothing had changed. Not outwardly. I still moved through. The days, like always, preparing meals, watering the garden, reminding my husband about dentist appointments. But inwardly, I had split. There was the woman I was for the world, and the woman I was becoming. Not better, not worse. Just awake. It started with small things. A grocery trip, for example. My husband stayed behind to finish some paperwork. His grandson offered to come with me. The drive was quiet at first. The kind of quiet where nothing needs to be said, because everything is already understood. In the produce aisle, I reached for tomatoes at the same time he did. Our fingers touched, and this time I didn't move away. He didn't either. That one moment, barely half a second, sent a ripple through me so strong I forgot what I had come to buy. On the way back, he turned on the radio. Some older jazz track filled the silence. I rested my arm along the window and watched the trees pass in a blur of green and light. "You look different lately," he said, without taking his eyes off the road. I glanced at him, but said nothing. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. That night, I chose not to sleep in a nightgown. Instead, I took out the robe I had bought weeks ago, the one I hadn't yet dared to wear. It felt like wearing a confession, but I wore it anyway, walked into the kitchen, pretending to fetch water. The house was quiet. My husband had fallen asleep in his armchair, television still humming. As I stood by the sink, I heard footsteps. He entered without surprise, shirtless, his sweatpants hanging loose on his hips. His eyes moved over me, not lewd, not possessive, just open, a slow inhale. "You shouldn't be here like this." I whispered, barely audible. "I didn't plan to be," he said. We stood there, the fridge humming beside us, the air between us charged and thick. Then he stepped forward, not recklessly, but deliberately, and kissed me again. This kiss wasn't careful. It was full of need, of restraint crumbling at the edges. His hands held my waist, not pulling, but grounding me. My fingers curled into his back, and for the first time, I allowed myself to press closer. And still, we said nothing. We separated. When we heard the creak of the armchair from the other room, I turned, smoothed my robe, poured the water. He stepped back into the hallway like a shadow, vanishing without sound. I stood there, glass in hand, pulse racing. Later that night, lying beside the man I had once chosen for safety, I realized I hadn't truly felt my own body in years. My husband's touch was routine now, predictable, brief, always preceded by the same sigh or question. There was no hunger, no curiosity left. And I had stopped missing it, until someone else reminded me what it was supposed to feel like. Thought about the hands that had touched me in the kitchen. Younger, yes, but not naive. There was a carefulness in him that didn't come from inexperience, but from knowing exactly what he was doing and who he was doing it to. I no longer wondered if it would happen again. I knew it would, and I wasn't going to stop it. I should have expected it. The shift. It didn't come with shouting or accusations. There was no confrontation, no evidence spilled across the kitchen table. It came in glances, in hesitation, in the absence of noise. My husband had never been a man of many words, but lately even his silences were different, less peaceful, more watchful. It began when he found the photo I'd forgotten to delete. It, just one mirror shot I'd taken weeks earlier, back at the cottage. I wasn't even naked, just standing in that new burgundy lingerie, partially draped in the robe, testing the light in the upstairs bedroom. I had told myself it was for me, a souvenir of something I hadn't yet lived, but I hadn't been careful. Was scrolling through recipes in the kitchen, and he passed me the phone without a word, the screen open to the gallery. "When was this taken?" he asked. His tone was even, but the air between us dropped 10 degrees. I stared at the image for a moment, then locked the screen without answering. "Back in May," I murmured, turning to stir the pot on the stove. As if the boiling water were suddenly urgent. He didn't press further, but I felt the beginning of suspicion settle behind his eyes. I could sense it in the way he lingered in doorways, watched me longer than usual, asked about errands he never cared for before. He became present in a way he hadn't been for years, but not out of love, out of curiosity or fear. The man, noticed it too. Our stolen moments had become more calculated, no longer playful, no longer spontaneous. There was caution in how we moved around the house, in how our hands hovered rather than touched. He began to text less. His conversations shortened. I could see him pulling back, not from disinterest, but from necessity. But I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. One evening, while my husband was away on a business dinner, we found ourselves in the backyard, under the porch light, pretending to discuss something mundane. I had a glass of wine. He had nothing in his hands. His arms were crossed, not in defiance, but in control. "You're avoiding me," I said, not looking at him. "I'm protecting you," he replied. His voice was low, unhurried. "From what?" "From being seen differently." I didn't answer, because I already was. Inside, my husband's study light was on. The curtains weren't drawn. I imagined him sitting at his desk, staring at spreadsheets or policy drafts, never suspecting that his wife, who folded his laundry, made his calls, reminded him about supplements, had become a woman who kissed another man in the dark. It wasn't about betrayal. Not really. It was about sensation, about electricity I thought my body had forgotten, about the heat in my chest when I caught his scent near the bathroom door, about the thrill of knowing someone wanted me again, not out of obligation, but out of undeniable pull, but I had begun to sense the edge. One night, I found my husband, sitting at the kitchen table long after dinner. The lights were dimmed, his elbows on the table. A single photo album laid open in front of him, old images, his daughter, her son, a life full of weekends and birthdays and family barbecues. "You ever miss when things were simpler?" he asked. I sat down across from him. Things were never simple. We just didn't know how complicated they were. He looked up, held my gaze for a moment, then nodded once and closed the album. That night, in our bedroom, he reached for me. Not hungrily, not even affectionately, just out of habit. I let him. I let the weight of his hand rest on my hip. I let him kiss my shoulder. I even turned toward him, offering what I could. But it wasn't the same. My body reacted like a script, his breath familiar, his rhythm known. But inside, I was somewhere else. I wasn't thinking about guilt or right and wrong. I was thinking about contrast, and when it was over and he rolled away with a soft sigh, I stared at the ceiling in the dark, heart steady but skin untouched. I knew then. The danger wasn't in being caught. The danger was in wanting more even. After I had tasted it, and still being willing to risk everything for it. The unraveling was quiet, not dramatic, not theatrical. Just slow, like fabric fraying at the hem of an old dress you haven't worn in years. One thread at a time until, suddenly, you're holding something that no longer fits the way it used to. I began avoiding eye contact with both of them. My husband, because I feared what he might see, and the other because I feared what I might want. There were moments when everything appeared untouched on the surface. We still sat at the dinner table, the three of us, passing dishes and asking about the day. My husband still kissed my cheek before bed. The younger man still took out the trash and asked if we needed anything from the store. And yet, the choreography of our lives had shifted. When he entered a room, my breath changed, not because I was startled, but because I needed to measure myself. Every glance, every step had to be precise now. Every accidental nearness carried risk. But distance didn't lessen the pull. If anything, it heightened it. I caught myself watching him from the kitchen window as he sat outside reading, legs stretched, head tilted back against the chair. There was an ease to his presence, even intention. A youth that wasn't naivety, but possibility. He wasn't trying to be anything for anyone. That's what made him dangerous. That's what made him impossible to forget. One morning, after my husband had left early for meetings, I stepped into the hallway and nearly collided with him coming out of the guest bathroom. We both stopped, inches apart. I was in a thin robe, damp hair falling loosely across my shoulders. He was shirtless, towel slung over his shoulder, the steam still clinging to his skin. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he stepped to the side, allowing me to pass. But as I did, his fingers grazed mine, not by mistake, not out of need, but as a reminder. I spent the rest of the day pretending to be unaffected. I cleaned out the pantry, organized receipts, rearranged shelves that didn't need rearranging, anything to keep my hands busy and my thoughts elsewhere. But every surface I touched carried the echo of something unspoken. And every minute I didn't see him, I felt his absence like a pull behind my ribs. Later that night, when the house was asleep, I wandered into the living room in the dark. I didn't know what I was looking for, maybe a ghost, maybe a way out. He was there, sitting in the armchair, headphones in, laptop glowing dimly. He didn't see me at first, but when he did, he removed one earbud and said softly, "Couldn't sleep?" I shook my head. He didn't ask why. I sat on the edge of the couch, knees drawn up, wrapping the throw blanket around my shoulders even though it wasn't cold. He didn't move closer. That was my choice to make, and I didn't move either. We stayed like that for nearly an hour. No words, just presence. Just the shared ache of two people who had crossed a line they could no longer uncross, trying not to collapse under the weight of wanting again. Eventually, I rose to leave. As I passed him, I hesitated. My hand brushed the back of his chair. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. That night, I dreamt of water, a vast lake, still and endless. I was walking into it fully clothed, letting it pull at the weight of my dress, soaking everything I wore until I could no longer feel the fabric clinging to my skin. When I woke, I wasn't sure if the dream was about drowning or cleansing. Maybe both. By morning, the tension in the house had grown thick. My husband, now more attentive than he had been in years, suggested a weekend away, just the two of us. He called it a reset. I nodded, offered a smile, and said I'd think about it. But inside, something recoiled. It wasn't guilt. It was grief. Not for what I had done, but for the part of me that once would have wanted to go. And that's when I realized I hadn't simply betrayed my husband. I had outgrown him, quietly, without malice, without drama, but completely. He stood in the doorway with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. I watched from the top of the stairs, arms folded, pretending to be casual, though my spine had stiffened the moment I heard the suitcase zipper echo down the hallway. I had heard it the night before, too, repeated openings and closings behind his door, the sounds of someone preparing to go, not just away, but elsewhere. I got the internship in Portland, he said. His voice was steady, but something in the way he avoided my eyes made the floor beneath me feel a degree less solid. Congratulations, I replied, and hated how automatic it sounded, like a script I'd memorized from a different life. There wasn't a scene, no confrontation, no demands for an explanation, just a soft letting go, like a breath released through pursed lips after holding it in too long. He walked past me down the stairs, his steps unhurried. My husband had left for the hospital early that morning and wouldn't be home until late evening. There would be no awkward farewell, no third set of eyes to catch what we didn't say. Just him and me. And the silence that had held so many of our secrets. At the door, he turned around, finally meeting my gaze. If things were different, he began, but didn't finish. They're not, I said quietly. I hadn't planned the words. They rose from someplace beneath my ribs, not bitter, not kind, just real. He nodded. It was enough. Then he left. The sound of the front door closing was deceptively soft for how final it felt. I stood there for a long time, still barefoot, the sun streaming through the side window catching in the dust. The air was still. The house, for all its structure and quiet, felt suddenly cavernous. In the hours that followed, I moved through the day like someone wearing someone else's body. I washed sheets, I made coffee I didn't drink, I opened the windows even though it was too warm. The rituals helped me pretend there was still something intact beneath the wreckage of what had almost become. My husband returned late, arms full of groceries and a tired smile on his face. He asked how my day had gone. I said it was uneventful. He didn't ask about the packed room upstairs. Or maybe he didn't notice. Maybe he'd grown so used to absence, he no longer questioned it. That night, he suggested the trip again. Just the two of us. A quiet weekend somewhere upstate, maybe. Walks in the woods. Dinners without phones. We've been drifting a little, he said, and I think we both feel it. He was right. We had been. But what he didn't know was that the drifting had already turned into distance. Not the kind you bridge with conversation or time away. The kind that settles inside you like sediment. Quiet, heavy, permanent. I told him I needed time to think. He nodded, kissed my forehead, and went to bed. I stayed up, sitting in the guest room that now felt like a tomb. I didn't cry. I wasn't heartbroken. What I felt was harder to name, a strange mix of ache and relief, of having come undone and not wanting to be stitched back together the same way. On the desk, I found a note. Folded once. No name. No greeting. If you ever want to feel alive again, you know where to find me. No signature. He hadn't needed one. I slipped it into the bottom drawer beneath some old photographs. I didn't know if I'd ever look at it again. I didn't know if I could, but I didn't throw it away, and that, more than anything, told me the story wasn't over. Not really.